Okay, so do you see my slides now?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you. You can start your presentation, Dr. Timur. Let me introduce you first to the audience. Yes. Today, our guest is Dr. Yannick Timur from Federal Reserve. It is the first seminar of Economics Department's seminar series for the spring semester. Thank you, Dr. Timur, for accepting our offer.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure. I mean, of course, I would have preferred to travel and to see you all in person. I hope we can do that at another time, and well, that also creates. Yeah.
Hopefully, we will be appreciate to see you.
Yeah.
Face to face. Okay, Dr. Timur, you can start your presentation.
Okay.
Then after your presentation, we can take comments and questions.
Yes. Also, please feel free to interrupt me at any time because this is still work in progress, and any comments are highly appreciated. So whether this is just a clarification question or questions more specifically on the content, please feel free to interrupt me at any time. So this paper is on the dominant currency financing channel of external adjustment and is joined with Kamila Casas and Serhii Milischuk from the IMF. As I am currently at the Federal Reserve Board and my co-authors are at the IMF, of course, the views that I'm presenting here are ours and not those of the institutions that we are affiliated with. So the motivation for our paper is that, of course, under the traditional Mundell-Fleming model, a depreciation in the exchange rate leads to an increase in the trade balance. And why is that the case? Because the relative price of exports for the country that is depreciating are declining. So demand from foreign countries is increasing, which leads to an increase in exports. On the other hand, when a country is depreciating, the price of imports is increasing and import quantities are falling. And therefore, the increase in the exports and the decline in the imports leads to an increase in the trade balance through a price channel, a relative price channel. However, a depreciation also increases debt repayments for firms that have debt denominated in foreign currency. So for example, when a firm is borrowing in US dollars and the domestic currency depreciates against the US dollar, the debt repayments in domestic currency are increased only through this depreciation. And this increase in debt repayments for the firms that have denominated debt in foreign currency leads to a decrease in their net worth and can potentially have contractionary effects on both exports and imports. And whether the effect on net exports or on the trade balance is positive or negative actually depends on the relative elasticity of exports and imports with respect to this increase in the debt repayments due to the depreciation. So in summary, what that means is that a depreciation may also have different effects on the trade balance through exports and imports, not through the typical kind of expenditure switching channel, but also through this channel that increases or decreases the debt repayments, which then affects the exports and imports. And that's what we're going to study in this paper. So let me give you an example from Colombia, which we use as a case study. So in Colombia, we have seen a very strong depreciation in 2014 and 15. So the exchange rate relative to the dollar was relatively constant between 2012 and mid-2014. But then in the third quarter of 2014, you saw this spike in the exchange rate going from around 2,000 Colombian pesos per dollar to around 3,500 pesos per dollar. And at the same time, both imports and exports were declining. And so in our study, we use granular data on imports and exports, as well as balance sheet information on firms to study what was going on and to what extent these debt revaluation effects contributed to this decline in imports and in exports. In particular, we study the foreign currency borrowing of firms just before the depreciation. And then we look into how differently the firms responded during and after this sharp and unexpected depreciation in Colombia. And let me highlight here, what is the reason actually for this decline, for the depreciation in the exchange rate. So Colombia is a very strong exporter of oil, but it's concentrated in just in a few firms. So what that means is that the exchange rate is actually extremely sensitive to swings in the oil price. So when the oil price goes down, which was happening here in 2014 and 15, which was kind of a global phenomenon, that led to this strong depreciation in the exchange rate. But a lot of firms, the vast majority of firms, were actually not responsible for this, of course, decline in the oil price and for the depreciation in the exchange rate. And that's why we believe that studying the Colombian experience of the firms that were actually not affected directly through the depreciation or through the oil price is appropriate to look at this channel. So then we provide evidence in favor of a new channel, how exchange rate movements can actually affect the external adjustment of a country. In particular, through the depreciation of the exchange rate, firms have increased debt repayments in local currency, and that has then contractionary effects on can potentially have projectionary effects on imports and exports. We also exploit a novel identification strategy, and we do not only exploit the total borrowing of the firm just before the depreciation, we also look into exactly when the firms have to repay their debt during this episode of the depreciation, and calculating how much additional debt in local currency the firms have to repay just because of this volatility and the strong depreciation in the exchange rate. So let me give you an example here. So it is the case that some firms, for example, have to pay back a lot of their debt on a Friday, versus some other firms have to pay back a lot of debt on the Monday. And the exchange rate can depreciate or appreciate quite strongly between Friday and Monday, and that can then affect strongly to what extent they have to pay back their debt in local currency. And then what we do is we test whether the reduction in firms' net worth or in terms of their debt repayments due to the depreciation can explain the sharp drop in exports and imports. We also then look more into the channels, the financial channel, what's exactly driving the results, why it is the case that firms actually may have to reduce their imports and exports. So let me preview the findings. We show that the increase in debt repayments and the reduction in net worth due to the depreciation actually does not have an effect on the exports of the firm. However, we find very, very strong evidence that the increase in debt repayments and the reduction in net worth due to the depreciation reduces imports very strongly. In particular, it explains around 17% of the drop in imports that we have seen in the graph that I showed you in the beginning. However, this drop in the imports is exclusively driven by non-exporting firms. And for these non-exporting firms, we can also see that the interest rates and the delinquency rates are increasing if they have more debt denominated in foreign currency or in US dollars. Why is that the case? Why is it the case that exports are unaffected and actually imports of exporters are also unaffected? One potential way to rationalize this finding is that Colombia has trade almost exclusively invoiced in US dollars. And when exports are priced in US dollars and prices are sticky, the export quantities are not responding, but the revenues in pesos are actually increasing. So this increase in peso revenues in response to the depreciation against the dollar, when they price in US dollars, increases their profits, and they can, due to these additional profits, can use these additional revenues to pay back their debt and are not as affected by the increase in debt repayments as other firms, which then means that they are not reducing the imports and not reducing the exports. This is, of course, only the case for firms that are exporting. Firms that are not exporting, as prices in Colombia itself are all in local currency, in pesos, these firms are still very strongly affected by this debt revaluation. But when you're exporting, this is not the case. If this is true, then we would also expect that firms that use FX derivatives or FX assets are to some extent hedged against this depreciation in terms of the financial channel. And we indeed find evidence that firms that have FX derivatives or FX assets are completely unaffected by this channel that we are highlighting. So let me maybe pause here for 1 second and ask if there are any questions so far. Okay, so no questions, then let me continue with a short review of the literature and how we contribute to it. So our paper contributes to various types of literature. First of all, how exchange rate have an effect on trade. But here we really do not study the expenditure switching mechanism, but instead we study a financial channel through which exchange rates have an effect on trade, both exports and imports. There are some papers that study financial frictions and trade, but compared to these papers, which mainly look at kind of bank credit supply shocks, we study foreign currency borrowing of the firm and not bank frictions. We actually hold bank frictions constant to some extent, and we study how this foreign currency borrowing affects exports and imports. We also contribute to the literature on dominant currency pricing and financing. So, for example, Gopinath and Stein and some others, they try to understand the complementarities between pricing and financing in dollars and what drives it. But in our case, we really study the effect of dominant currency financing under dominant currency pricing. So we hold dominant currency pricing fixed because we know in Colombia almost all exports are actually priced in dollars, and then we vary the extent of dominant currency financing, and then we study to what extent dominant currency financing under dominant currency pricing affects trade. Then, of course, there's a large literature on foreign currency borrowing and the effects on certain firm outcomes, but compared to these studies, we actually look at trade and not at some other outcomes such as investment. So we really study what the effect of exchange rates are through this different channel on the external adjustment and not on domestic variables. So how do we address that question? We use data from Colombia, and in particular, we merge different types of data sets with each other. We start with the disaggregated customs firm level trade data from DANE, which is publicly available. Then we use the credit registry from the Superintendencia Financiera, which was available to us when Camila Casas was employed at the Banco de la República, which is confidential data. Then we merged that with standard balance sheet data from Orbis. We use foreign assets data also from the Banco de la República, and the FX derivatives data is also coming from the Banco de la República. And after merging all of these data sets, we can actually match over 90% of imports or exports of the firm. So despite losing sometimes a bunch of observations when we merge all of these firms together, we really match a vast majority of imports and exports, which we think is important to really understand the dynamics that are going on and having no kind of bias when we try to come up with our estimates and try to aggregate it to the country level. So which identification strategy are we employing? We use a standard difference and difference approach around this sudden and unanticipated depreciation of the peso. And as I mentioned before, the depreciation was driven by a drop in oil prices. So it was really sudden and unanticipated, which is important because if it was really anticipated or if it was driven kind of by certain firms that we use as treated firms or something like that, that could really also affect our results in a way that we would not want it to be affected. So it's also not really a result of a macro crisis. So it's not the case that Colombia was in a recession and that's why the exchange rate was depreciating. It was really kind of like an external factor that caused the depreciation in the exchange rate. And so then we compare firms with each other before and after the depreciation with a lot and with little foreign currency exposure in terms of their balance sheet. On the left-hand side, we have the log of the quarterly firm level exports and imports, and then we interact the foreign currency exposure with this post dummy, which takes the value of 1 when at the time of the depreciation. We also include firm and time fixed effects in the regression to control for firm time invariant specific factors and time trends. Our measure of foreign currency exposure takes 3 different variables: the foreign currency leverage itself, the liquidity shock, and the wealth shock. So let me tell you a little bit what these are. So the foreign currency leverage is just the overall amount of foreign currency borrowing a firm has just before the depreciation over their total assets. Then, of course, one problem with that could be that firms are different in terms of different characteristics and not only in terms of the foreign currency leverage. So if we are trying to estimate this regression, we could mix up the foreign currency leverage with some other characteristics which are really then responsible for our result. That's why we use this novel liquidity shock to study the financial exposure of the firms to the depreciation. And this liquidity shock is increase in debt payments due to the depreciation between 2014 Q1 and 2015 Q3, which is exactly the episode of the depreciation. So what we do is we take the foreign currency borrowing just before the depreciation, and then we look at exactly when firms have debt maturing during this depreciation episode between 2014 Q1 and 2015 Q3. And depending on when exactly they have the debt maturing in foreign currency, we can calculate how much more in domestic currency they have to repay just because of this external exogenous depreciation. And we believe that this gives us a way to causally kind of identify what the effect of this foreign currency exposure is on imports and on exports. One worry one may have with that is that firms that borrow very short term are the ones that are more exposed and are also different in terms of other characteristics and therefore respond differently. So that's what. So we start actually in 2014 Q1 to kind of rule that out to some extent, because the depreciation only started in 2014 Q3. So actually, the firms that borrow in the very short, just for 1 quarter or so, they would actually show up with kind of a positive liquidity shock, because there was a small appreciation in the peso just before this big depreciation started. We also are going to do a bit more, which I'm going to come back to in order to address that issue, that this liquidity shock is really capturing some other characteristics. Then we are also not only interested economically in this liquidity shock and how it affects qualitatively the imports and exports, but also how a wealth shock, so this additional increase in the debt burden that matures past the depreciation that is still affected, affects the imports and exports. So we add actually to the liquidity shock the additional increase in debt that matures past 2015 Q3, and we compare the liquidity shock and the wealth shock to each other to understand really whether it is the liquidity shock that's what's driving it, or really the debt revaluation that is not immediately affecting the firms during the depreciation. So let me start with the findings on exports. As I already revealed before, we actually do not find very strong evidence in favor of an export reduction or a change in the exports depending on the amount of foreign currency borrowing of the firms. Indeed, we find that when we interact the post-dummy with the foreign currency leverage, the liquidity shock, LS, or the wealth shock, WS, we find that there is it's a negative coefficient, but it's very small, and it's also statistically insignificant. And so essentially, if you look at this, if we instead of replace the post dummy with a dummy for each period and we plot it over time, we see that this effect is actually statistically not different in the post depreciation period compared to the pre-depreciation period. So you see that when there is a depreciation in the exchange rate in 2014 and 15, you see that there's almost no change in the coefficient. So the coefficient is always very close to zero, and when you look at the confidence intervals, they are always at they're always overlapping with the zero, meaning that really we do not find any strong effect of foreign currency borrowing on exports. So now let's move to imports. For imports, we indeed find evidence that ex-ante foreign currency borrowing reduces the imports during the depreciation, and you can see that in the negative and strongly significant coefficients in 1 and 2. When we look at 1, this captures all firms. When we look at 2, this only captures firms that are not exporters, and column 3 captures firms that are actually exporting. And you see a very strong difference between the coefficients in 1 and 2 and 3. And you can see indeed that when you look at only firms that are exporting, if they have more foreign currency borrowing just before the crisis, before the depreciation, you do not see that they are reducing significantly their imports during the depreciation episode. And this is confirmed when we look at the other measures of the foreign currency exposure, in particular, when you look at the liquidity shock in column 4, 5, and 6, you see again in 4 and 5 are statistically significant, but 6 is statistically insignificant and much smaller in magnitude, meaning that when the liquidity shock hits firms that are exporting, they do not reduce their imports in response to during the depreciation period. The last 3 columns reflect the wealth shock, and you can see that again the results are similar. The wealth shock captures also the liquidity shock, and when you look at the coefficient of the wealth shock compared to the liquidity shock, you see that the coefficient increases slightly, but the increase in the coefficient is not that large, leading us to conclude that most of the result is actually driven by the liquidity shock and not by the wealth shock. So if firms have to repay a lot of their debt during the depreciation episode, this really is what's reducing the imports. But the additional debt that they have to repay after the depreciation period is actually during that time, during the depreciation episode, they're not internalizing, they are not reducing the imports due to this revaluation that is coming later, but it's not affecting their liquidity just during the depreciation. So let me show you again the coefficient for each quarter. And now you can see very strongly that before the depreciation, firms with more or less foreign currency borrowing did not have a different amount of importing before the depreciation. But when the depreciation hit, you can see that firms that were borrowing more in foreign currency borrowing, they reduced strongly their imports relative to firms that had less foreign currency borrowing. When you look at the results only for the firms that are actually exporting, you see that there is again no such effect. This looks very much similar to the results on exports. So you can see that exporters, which are of course the ones that are exporting, and the imports of exporters are both unaffected. When you compare the importers and exporters to each other in the same graph, you can see that again for non-exporters, you see that there's a very strong decline in the imports when the depreciation hits, if they have more foreign currency borrowing. But for exporters, you do not find such an effect. So how much does our channel actually explain of the decline in imports? Of course, it doesn't explain anything of the decline in exports because our coefficients are extremely small and statistically insignificant. So in order to study the counterfactual without foreign currency borrowing, we use our estimated effects to infer the counterfactual response of trade flows, of course, only in partial equilibrium, because there could be many other general equilibrium effects going on that would affect this back of the envelope calculation. But in order to get an understanding of how large these magnitudes really are, we do this counterfactual exercise in partial equilibrium, and we can plot the actual amount of imports that the firms have relative to the amount of imports that the firms would have without any foreign currency borrowing. And so then you can see when the depreciation hits, you can see that the imports of firms is going down from like 2,500 million to around 10,000. And you can see that when you look at the in a counterfactual scenario, if the firms didn't have any of this debt in foreign currency, you see that the peak to throw import contraction would be 17% smaller. So it doesn't explain, of course, all of the decline in imports, but it explains 17%, which is, we think, a relatively large amount. And of course, the remaining drop, even without any foreign currency borrowing, could then be explained through other channels, such as the expenditure switching channel. But we really think that our channel here really is a big contributor. Now, going back a little bit to the identification, of course, one issue that one could have is that the firms that have a lot of foreign currency borrowing, they are also different in terms of other characteristics. So, for example, they have a they have worse management, and when a shock hits, whatever shock that is, a depreciation or something like that, they just contract more. And this is really not because of their financing in dollars. That's why we first moved to this liquidity shock, which conceptually should address that issue to some extent, but there are still some certain characteristics that this liquidity shock may be correlated with. So, for example, firms that are really borrowing short term, one would expect them maybe to have a different exposure to the shock in terms of the liquidity shock than firms that are like kind of better firms and that are differently exposed then. And here we kind of test for that, and we look into whether this liquidity shock is correlated with some other firm characteristics, such as the size, whether they experience different credit supply shocks, whether they are different age, whether they have different profits before the depreciation, and whether their maturity, the average maturity is different. Of course, their maturity structure must be different, but the average maturity is actually not different. And also, we cannot really see that the firms that have differential liquidity shocks are different in terms of other characteristics, which gives us more and more confidence that actually this liquidity shock is a relatively good treatment variable for us to investigate the effects of more foreign currency borrowing on imports and exports. So when we actually then control for all of these characteristics in our baseline regression, we indeed see that the coefficient on the interaction between the post-dummy and the liquidity shock is not changing, and it stays virtually the same. And we also include here sector times time fixed effects, and also these are not really affecting our results. Then we look into the question whether it is really kind of the foreign currency borrowing that is driving the result, or whether just overall indebtedness is one factor. So when there is a depreciation, and potentially with this depreciation also financial conditions tighten and so on, maybe firms that are overall more levered, not only in terms of their domestic, not only in terms of their foreign currency, but also in terms of domestic currency, they may also be more affected. However, we actually do not find effects of higher domestic leverage affecting imports and exports during the depreciation episode, which again gives us more confidence to conclude that this is really about the currency, the US dollar borrowing instead of the total borrowing of the firm. One other issue we address is we so far have mixed kind of prices and quantities in our imports regressions, but we actually use this granular trade data now to construct the units and the kilograms that the firms are importing, and we confirm that it is not only the case that overall the value of the imports are declining when firms borrow more in foreign currency, but it is also the case that the actual quantities are declining. We also see that firms actually start importing from fewer countries, and they start importing fewer products. So there also seems to be an extensive margin effect going on here. Now, what can explain our results that exporters and importers are very differently affected when you look at the import contraction of these firms? So firms that export are hedged to some extent when there is this depreciation in the currency, because the exports in Colombia are invoiced in US dollars. And so when Colombian trade is almost exclusively invoiced in US dollars, to some extent, when you have this depreciation in the exchange rate, what happens is that the revenues in pesos are increasing automatically, which then can offset the higher debt servicing costs. So this is kind of what we have seen so far, and can rationalize our results that exporters are differently affected than non-exporters. And indeed, that exporters do not reduce their imports when they have more foreign currency borrowing. But there are also other forms of being hedged. So for example, firms may actually not export, but firms may have FX assets, because they are, of course, aware that when they borrow in foreign currency, that when they do so, then the depreciation increases their debt servicing costs, and instead they then hold FX assets, or they use FX derivative contracts to hedge against this debt revaluation due to the depreciation. So if you look at the number of firms that are using these derivatives or the foreign assets potentially to hedge, you can see that, of course, this is much more prevalent among exporters than it is among non-exporters. So for example, you see that 26% of all exporters actually have foreign assets, while only 4% of the non-exporters have foreign assets. When you look at the derivatives, you can see that only 1.6% of the non-exporters have FX derivatives, while 5.6% of the exporters have derivatives. So we're going to make use of this variation now to study to what extent using FX assets or using FX derivatives can also hedge against the depreciation in terms of the financial channel. So let us start with the derivatives. So we can now see that so here we define a dummy that is equal to 1 if the firm before the depreciation has any FX assets or any FX derivatives. And then we estimate the regression that we were estimating before, but we add an additional interaction term between the foreign currency exposure, the hedge dummy, and the post dummy, and we study to what extent then this additional term, so the beta 2 here in this respect, can offset the beta 1. So if beta 2 has the same absolute magnitude than beta 1, that means that the hedge can fully offset the negative effect of foreign currency borrowing. And so, in other words, the double interaction between post and foreign currency leverage reflects the effect of firms that are not hedging, neither through assets nor through derivatives. And when you look at the results, you can see that indeed the triple interaction has the very similar coefficient in absolute magnitudes than the double interaction. So what does it mean? Yeah. So we see that firms that do not hedge their currency risk, they contract imports much more strongly if they have more foreign currency borrowing than if they don't. However, once firms hedge, this effect is mitigated strongly, even to an extent that it completely offsets the negative effect on imports if you have more foreign currency borrowing. Now we again split between firms that are not exporting and are exporting. And so you may say the results on firms that were exporting are only driven by the fact that they are more kind of sophisticated firms that potentially also hedge through other forms. So, for example, through derivatives or through foreign assets. But when we look at the firms that are exporting but do not have any other form of hedging, such as derivatives or foreign assets, we still do not find that these firms, these exporters, reduce their imports if they have more foreign currency leverage than other firms. So it's really the case that the hedging with FX derivatives or with FX assets is a substitute to having exports, because exports give you this additional hedging mechanism that leads to an increase in your revenues in pesos when there's depreciation, but having FX assets or FX derivative does the same thing. So when you're an importer and you're not exporting, having FX assets or FX derivatives is sufficient to hedge you, and so is having exports, but not hedging through either derivatives or through foreign assets. And the results are qualitatively the same for the foreign currency leverage, for the liquidity shock, and for the wealth shock. So now let's kind of also see whether it is the case that foreign assets and FX derivatives have the same effect. And indeed, we find that when we look at foreign assets only, and so we define the hedge dummy here as a 1 if the firm has, before the depreciation, foreign assets only, but can have derivatives, but doesn't have to have derivatives. And in this case, we find that the importing firms with foreign assets are hedged, but the exporters without foreign assets are also hedged. So again, the two, having foreign assets, they are to some extent, having foreign assets and exporting are to some extent substitutes. With derivatives, we find the same. Importing with FX derivatives, importing firms with FX derivatives that are not exporting are hedged. Exporting firms without FX derivatives are also hedged. Again, all three FX derivatives, foreign assets, and exporting are all hedging you against this channel that we are documenting. Now let's look into kind of the financial frictions under the microscope that are really going on here. And to do that, we actually use the credit registry to shed light exactly on the mechanism through which the depreciation and the higher foreign currency borrowing affects delinquencies, interest rates, and then the borrowing of the firms. So in order to do that, we look first at the delinquencies and we regress a delinquency dummy, which is one, if the firm has ever been, is delinquent in a certain period. We regress this delinquent dummy on the interaction between the foreign currency exposure, as we did before, and the post dummy. And again, we can see very similar, mirroring the results that we had before, that firms that had more foreign currency exposure before the depreciation, to the depreciation, they actually have higher delinquencies than the firms that do not have a lot of foreign currency borrowing or have a lower liquidity shock than the other firms. Again, this is only driven by non-exporters and not exporters, confirming this mechanism that the increase in the debt repayments causes firms to struggle with repaying their debt, making them more likely to become delinquent. However, when they have exports in US dollars, the increase in revenues due to the depreciation allows them to use these additional revenues to pay back their debt and not to become delinquent. We see that also in the interest rates. When you look at the interest rates charged at origination for the firms with more or less foreign currency borrowing, again, you see for non-exporters, the firms are paying higher interest rates during the depreciation if they want to get a new loan relative to firms that have less foreign currency exposure. And for firms that are exporting, again, that's not the case because the bank knows that their probability of default is much lower having being an exporter and being hedged against this depreciation. In terms of borrowing, we see that the firms that are facing this liquidity shock or have more foreign currency borrowing indeed also reduce their borrowing. Here we actually do not find a differential effect for exporters versus non-exporters, because to some extent the firms that are exporting, they do not necessarily need to borrow more because they have these additional revenues coming through the exporting channel. So let me conclude. In this paper, we provide evidence of a novel channel, how exchange rates affect trade. In particular, we show that the debt revaluation due to domestic depreciation leads to a decline in imports for non-exporters, no change for the imports for exporters, and no change for the exports. Overall, this channel means that when there's a debt revaluation due to domestic depreciation, leads to an increase in the trade balance. So when we compare different theories with each other, we of course know that when there's a depreciation under the Mandel-Fleming model, we see that there's a decrease in imports and an increase in exports. Under dominant currency pricing, under the DCP theory, because firms price in US dollars, there is of course also the decrease in the import, but because exports are priced in US dollars, export quantities actually stay the same. When we then actually look at dominant currency financing and dominant currency pricing together, imports go down even more than under Mandel-Fleming or under DCP. Exports still stay the same as it is the case under DCP and not as it is the case in Mandel-Fleming. But in addition to that, financial conditions, especially for those firms that are not exporting, are deteriorating strongly, potentially leading to additional second round effects of these firms that can further deteriorate their imports. overall, what that means is that really developing hedging markets can shield countries from these contractionary depreciations. Thank you so much. I'm happy to receive questions and happy to discuss more. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Timur, for your beautiful presentation. Dear participants, do you have any questions or comments? One person raising hands. Who is it? Dr. Çırpıcı. Yes, you can ask.
Thank you for your presentation, first of all. I wonder whether it is possible to give any threshold for the amount of debt or amount of foreign currency that firms really have that will really cause them trouble. I mean, before any depreciation, can we say anything about the firms that may go into crisis, let's say? If they have certain amount of debt, they will go in a worse position in a case of depreciation. I wonder. Okay. Anything? Can you predict anything about it?
So that's a great question. We haven't studied the kind of like non-linearities really of having more and more foreign currency debt. So for example, it may be fine if 10% of your debt is in foreign currency and then the rest is in domestic currency. But I think it really depends on the strength of the depreciation, because even if a low amount of foreign currency debt seems fine in terms of normal depreciation periods, even a small amount can really cause big problems if the depreciation is sufficiently large. So in our case, we really only study the effect of like this one depreciation. Also, we have some other exercises where we go to the panel, but it really depends on the strength of the depreciation, because if you have a depreciation of 10%, of course, that has a completely different effect than if you have a depreciation of 50%. So it's really the interaction between the two, and since of course it's very difficult to predict the degree of the depreciation, it's also very difficult to predict which level is sustainable.
Thank you very much.
Yes, is there any questions? Or comments? It seems there's no more question or comments. If not, I'm going to end the session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Timur, again for your contribution. Our departmental seminars will continue with Dr. Acemoğlu in 16th of March. See you in our next seminar.